From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out to the U.S. Naval Observatory Library. My name is Rob Casper. I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center at the Library of Congress, and we are very pleased to be partnering with the U.S. Naval Observatory and with the library's FedLink division, which stands for Federal Library and Information Network, to bring you this first ever event, Poetry in the Stars. A little information about the library and this library. The Library of Congress is the nation's world's largest library. This is the largest astronomy library in the United States. Sally Boskin, who is a librarian here, told me that this is one of 6 rooms that contain the collection for the library, and that this is the only pretty room, that all the others are downstairs in the basement. So this is also, I've heard, the room where the vice president does his interviews. So we are in hallowed ground, legislatively speaking and militarily speaking, and certainly in terms of libraries. FedLink, the organization that I talked about that is co-sponsoring this event, is led by Blaine Dessy, and this event was the brainchild of Blaine Dessy and by Sally Boskin. FedLink connects to libraries, federal libraries around the world, and we at the Library of Congress hope to promote poetry and literature at events like this, and at our newly launched Pizza and Poetry series at Andrews Air Force Base. We had a pizza and poetry event this past spring. There was good poetry and there was plenty of pizza. This is a different kind of event. Let me just ask you right now to turn off your cell phones or any electronic devices you have so that they don't interfere with our recording equipment or the event. As I said, I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center. The center has been the home to the consultant in poetry and the Poet Laureate consultant in poetry for the past 75 years. We also sponsor all sorts of readings, events, lectures, and wonderful, exciting conversations such as we'll have in just a few minutes. To find out more about our events and to sign up to receive emails about our events, you can go to www.loc.gov/poetry. This morning, we are lucky enough to be in this lovely space and have a chance to imagine the skies and the stars as poets have for centuries. To lead us, we have poet Elizabeth Arnold, who will read from and respond to poets as wide-ranging as Keats, Robert Creeley, Elizabeth Bishop, and Archilochos, a Greek poet who hopefully I pronounced correctly. She will also weave in her own poems on astronomical themes and speak as someone who creates poetry from the simple act of looking up and the complex reckoning such an act involves. Elizabeth will read, and I will follow with a short moderated discussion. We will also have time afterwards for any questions you may have. Please be aware that this event is being recorded by the Library of Congress, and any question you ask will be included in our webcast. That should go up hopefully in a few months after this. Elizabeth Arnold, our guest poet, is the author of 3 poetry collections, The Reef, Civilization, and Effacement, which came out in 2010 by Flood Editions. She has received an Amy Lowell Traveling Scholarship, a Whiting Writers Award, a Bunting Fellowship from Radcliffe College, and a Fine Arts Work Center Fellowship. She teaches in the MFA program at the University of Maryland and lives in Hyattsville, Maryland. Please welcome Elizabeth Arnold.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to everyone who came and all the staff who put up signs in very creative ways, witty ways sometimes, to get from the airport. What am I talking about? From the parking lot to here. And this is an amazing room. I really feel like a telescope could be in here. It has that kind of observatory feel to it. As I was thinking about the poems that I'd read, I started to realize how much I love it that the universe sort of comes in just little instants in poems about other things, earthly things. And then it started to dawn on me how the universe is everything, in everything, including Earth, a planet in the universe after all. And that reminded me of how fast and constantly everything's moving and how we emerged within that circumstance, the way delicate-seeming, thin-skinned sea creatures did that live so deep in the ocean under miles and miles of water. Why aren't they crushed? Thoughts of the universe haunt us, thoughts of how small and helpless we are in relation to it. To ignore this is an instinct of survival. But it's the poet's job to remind us who we are and where we are, to exhilarate us by revealing what we fear, and to bring it all alive. The first poem I'll read is by Keats, and it's one of his early poems. It was kind of a breakthrough poem for him, and it's called On First Looking into Chapman's Homer, a particular wonderful translation of Homer. And the brief appearance of a planet toward the end of the poem just makes the poem for me. It's the thing that I remember after having read it many, many times. And I think it's somehow the way it appears resembles what Chapman's reading this new translation of Homer did for Keats, how it astonished him. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I, like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. That the planet's swimming, I think, is part of swims into view. So beautiful. It's the thing that, like I say, it's the thing I remember, even though the ending is also very stunning. The state of awe that these people are in by discovering the Pacific Ocean that they didn't anticipate seeing. Sometimes just calling attention to the fact that we're on Earth at all is enough. As in a poem of mine called Trees and George Oppen's Forms of Love. I'll read my poem first. Trees. Trees know which way's up, rallying after the two blizzards just about broke them. Their bent branches so far down, and some did break. There was a snapped trunk, our narrow maple, trying to grow out of the stump now, reddish, soft new leaves, but they're coming out sideways. Still, the branches only bent by the snow heaps now have stems poking up from the X sides of their down-curved limbs, that they know gravity, vertigo from the inside, feel the heave and spin of the globe, grow skyward from that as if crying, I guess isn't so surprising. And here's George Oppen's poem, The Forms of Love. Parked in the fields all night, so many years ago, we saw a lake beside us when the moon rose. I remember leaving that ancient car together. I remember standing in the white grass beside it. We groped our way together downhill in the bright, incredible light, beginning to wonder whether it could be lake or fog we saw, our heads ringing under the stars. We walked to where it could have wet our feet had it been water. In another poem set mostly at night, Elizabeth Bishop's Man Moth, our vulnerability and awe vis-a-vis the universe takes center stage. This half man, half moth, the title came from a misprint in the paper, it was supposed to be Mammoth, has a childlike sensibility. He sees things newly, the way kids can, including the moon. He sees it as a hole in the sky, proving the sky quite useless for protection. Here above, cracks in the buildings are filled with battered moonlight. The whole shadow of man is only as big as his hat. It lies at his feet like a circle for a doll to stand on. And he makes an inverted pen, the point magnetized to the moon. He does not see the moon. He observes only her vast properties, feeling the queer light on his hands, neither warm nor cold, of a temperature impossible to record in thermometers. But when the man moth pays his rare, although occasional visits to the surface, the moon looks rather different to him. He emerges from an opening under the edge of one of the sidewalks and nervously begins to scale the faces of the buildings. He thinks the moon is a small hole at the top of the sky, proving the sky quite useless for protection. He trembles, but must investigate as high as he can climb. Up the facades, his shadow dragging like a photographer's cloth behind him, he climbs fearfully, thinking that this time he will manage to push his small head through that round, clean opening and be forced through, as from a tube, in black scrolls on the light. Man, standing below him, has no such illusions. But what the man moth fears most, he must do, although he fails, of course, and falls back scared, but quite unhurt. Then he returns to the pale subways of the cement he calls his home. He flits, he flutters, and cannot get aboard the silent trains fast enough to suit him. The doors close swiftly. The man moth always seats himself facing the wrong way, and the train starts at once at its full, terrible speed, without a shift in gears or a gradation of any sort. He cannot tell the rate at which he travels backwards. Each night he must be carried through artificial tunnels and dream recurrent dreams. Just as the ties recur beneath his train, these underlie his rushing brain. He does not dare to look out the window, for the third rail, the unbroken draft of poison, runs there beside him. He regards it as a disease he has inherited the susceptibility to. He has to keep his hands in his pockets, as others wear mufflers. If you catch him, hold up a flashlight to his eye. It's all dark pupil, an entire night itself, whose haired horizon tightens as he stares back and closes up the eye. Then from the lids, one tear, his only possession, like the bee's sting, slips. Slyly he palms it, and if you're not paying attention, he'll swallow it. However, if you watch, he'll hand it over, cool as from underground springs and pure enough to drink. I think my having read this poem about 1 million times led to the writing of this untitled fragment. You can see more as a soul, darkness speeding into darkness. Earth's harder, like a spacecraft on re-entry. The body has to burn its way through the sky's lens. The universe is a place of wonder, a place of fear. We fear it because we have no control over it. We're of it, though also on the ground looking up at it, stuck on the ground not knowing where we're going. Robert Creeley has a humorous take on this state of affairs, and I know a man. As I said to my friend, because I'm always talking, John, I said, which was not his name, the darkness surrounds us. What can we do against it? Or else shall we, and why not? Buy a goddamn big car. Drive, he said. For Christ's sake, look out where you're going. A similar kind of anxiety is the subject of a pair of my poems. The first one contains a line in which 4 of the 5 words begin with vowels, anywhere other than on earth. The sound dramatizing our vulnerability. No consonants, no armor. Our houses' little roofs begin to seem so thin, so frail. The first one is a pair is called rare earth. The biophysicists who think there's little chance that life, advanced that is, exists anywhere other than on Earth, say what I felt last night before I read their book, in which they state we're right against it, the abyss, a word whose tone had killed it for me until this. Solstice. We laugh to think the Romans lit great fires in December to persuade the sun to come back, to persuade the sun. Fears about the sun's constancy led to this poem about the enormous prehistoric grave mounds north of Dublin, positioned so that the sun's beams enter the inner chambers at certain times each year. Nobody knows why. I speculate about that at the end. But it just so happens that the angle of the sun's light has shifted slightly over the millennia, a source of anxiety for the speaker. At Brú na Bóin. The tumulus, I thought it was a hill at first. Trees grow out of one ensuum. Entered into. It was a clear day, bright, the grass bounded by its hedgerows, too green all around and down, the field squares troubled only by the Boyne that just about makes an island of this place, snaking through. Sunbeams don't snake, at least not visibly, though 5,000 years have worked at the Earth's orbit. Still, the light goes into the mound, through holes one to a side that tunnel towards each other but don't meet. The sun arriving on time every year unless it's cloudy. But to do what? Wake the corpse. Wilfred Owen, oh great. Thank you. I meant to ask for that. Wilfred Owen, a poet who fought and died in World War I, makes a similar demand of the sun in his poem, Futility. Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once, at home, whispering of fields half sown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rouse him now, the kind old sun should know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs, so dear achieved, our sides, still warm. Hang on. Sorry about that. Our sides, full-nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all? A little bit of particle and astrophysics came in handy in a group of poems about my fear of inheriting a family tendency toward mental illness. Here are two short poems from that sequence, both obsessing about origins. My knowledge of astro and particle physics is pretty small. So anyway, I'm feeling a little intimidated by all these, Newtons over there and Galileo. Anyway, I'm a poet. Genealogy. How is drainage from the blood from tissues different from the water seeping out of swamps above the tree line into streams, then rivers? As much force in us as in an atom's binding split. How different from ideas out of a culture into actions, us. Geology 2. Two galaxies, magnetic electricities turn, pulling toward each other, their flat-seeming disks, the energy extending outward, souls on the outside still intact, articulate, live spinning holes, until some other force infringes, disks convulsing into inside-out parentheses, decoalescing, all of it happening so far in the past, just as our heads are stuffed with the ghosts we're steered by. Everything always moving, Earth moving around the sun, a star, and a galaxy that is itself moving, the universe expanding, a hurricane offshore in North Florida where I grew up, and bad news about a biopsy led to thoughts about celestial motion, or one thought, as in so many of these poems, it occurs in an instant. This is from my book, which is a book-length sequence called The Reef. It doesn't have a title. Here I am a third time, lying on the metal bed in sheets. The surgeon's tools wink blankly back against the green-tiled windowless walls. A nurse's hand like ice in mine. I watch the doctor's mouth speak words, while all his other parts, the eyes, the shoulders, hands, say he is sorry. He the knower, healer, doer, as he tells me it's come back, recurred, awakened, de-remissed. But I don't freeze. Just when I hear the words, I'm more alert than even in those heady times when nothing hurts. Beginning, middle, end make one clear frame, inside of which I fit. Back home, outdoors, I sit and stare, hearing in the usual background noise the whistling of the front door keyhole tightened to a buzzing moan, which wakes me up, but this time to a storm, offshore somewhere, a just-named hurricane spinning at the water underneath, hurling the sky out from itself in spirals, hundreds of miles beyond the place it started, which has, with Earth, gone past that point, folding at higher and higher speeds the raw material air into its mass, until great gusts of wind enrage the oaks, send dead leaves scuttling up the street, while cloud bands give and take away light, turning the world into a carnival no one escapes. A living poet, Jim Powell, dramatizes this kind of motion for a longer period. It's not a very long poem, but anyway, in the desert, it consumes the poem. Once in the night we were falling, with the whole earth heavy beneath us, away from the stars that fell toward us, at the same speed into a loneliness, our singularity, birth gate to grave, in that ungentle darkness opening, gathered our falling like cupped hands. Even inside the earth, underground, the heavenly bodies influence what is happening, as is shown in the opening lines of a long poem I'm working on about the largest active volcano in Europe, Mount Etna. I lived for 7 months recently in Sicily and just I could see Etna from my patio. The asthenosphere, which probably you guys know since you're scientists, a lot of you, is the partially molten upper level of the Earth's mantle. And Enceladus is a titan from Greek mythology. He angered Zeus, who as punishment had him buried alive under Etna. Also, I mentioned flank vents, and in Etna, most of the most memorable eruptions happen out of the side of the mountain. And the reason they're so terrible is that they're closer to towns. There are a lot of people live and farm on Etna because the soil is enriched by the lava. Okay. Right now I'm calling the poem The Mountain. Lands alive. I don't mean teeming, breathing. Etna swells, as well as changing shape, height, filling in a bay so that the castle's stranded. Magmatic tides rise, fall in the asthenosphere, responding to the sun and moon, the Earth's crust bending slightly. Earthquakes swarm across the globe. It's feared the very highest subterranean tides could actually knock Earth off its axis. Something practically knocked the whole volcano over 8,000 years ago, and a third of it slid off the island it consisted of at that point, fell into the sea, and the Mediterranean overflowed. Beautiful mountain, mountain of the dead, whose lithic clasts and fumaroles, whose pyroclastic flows go under the lava showers and phreatic bursts, engendered by the titan Enceladus, trapped, fighting up at rock. No way out in any case from under, as the flank vents open only once, choked thereafter. Okay, so I'm going to close with a couple of poems, and they're both political poems that bring the universe in. The first is another one by George Oppen, who was responding to the Vietnam War. The poem crescendos by making us aware of our presence in space. It's called Eclogue. The men talking near the room's center. They have said more than they intended, pinpointing in the uproar of the living room an assault on the quiet continent. Beyond the window, flesh and rock and hunger, loose in the night sky, hardened into soil, tilting of itself to the sun once more. Small vegetative leaves and stems taking place outside, oh small ones, to be born. So the poem, a lot of Oppen poems had this kind of way of just having this immense wonder at the world. And so even a poem about a war seems positive at the end. Those small ones seem kind of vulnerable to me, so I worry about them a little bit. The last poem I'll read is called Civilization, and I wrote it. And it was inspired by the September 11th attacks, even from the vantage point of Washington, as opposed to New York. Something as extreme as the world coming apart, literally, materially, didn't seem too big a metaphor for how the events that day made me feel about my own safety and about history. Civilization. The British journalist's voice was spent as she said, unenthusiastically, the interview now over, thanks, with the eager, young, insatiable American official turning then to other matters. But the voice, a European's, flat, well-schooled in the world's hope-pulverizing particle storm's gifts of disappointment, stayed. The syllable's slight elongation, something on the order of the querulous sendings of frail human wonderings out into the void, as if the waning of her voice spoke all of history's ups and downs, a honeycomb's packed maze of cells whose lights shine through their tiny paper membranes, too thin not to be available to being torn, light leaking from a world cracked open, sky seen through the pavement I walked down. Okay, thank you. I just realized I didn't read Archilochus.
That's okay.
I took
okay,
Archilochus
okay.
out. Yeah.
There was once a Greek poet who spoke about the stars in Elizabeth's talk. Thank you very, very much for a terrific talk. The first question I wanted to ask you is that I realized you began by talking about the stars and poetry and speed, and yet I'm struck when thinking about the poems you read and about sort of our relationship to the heavens, about slowness, about time beyond time, that may speak to how poems may be better equipped to address the celestial than stories or fiction. And maybe I thought you could talk about that.
Well, I think lyric poetry slows time down. It has these little moments where I always feel like things, time is big. If it's possible to stretch it out and slow it down, and you're inside kind of a moment. And I think if a poet can do that, you're sort of pulled into something just astounding, even though it's right here. And so I think thinking about what's happening, the fact that we're in this universe and things are moving so fast, and I don't know. I feel like to slow things down is crucial in order to have insight, human insight. It was a strange thing to prepare this because I didn't quite know. I started looking at poems and it's like the poems that I thought of, had these little tiny moments in them. They weren't really about the stars. Maybe Jim Powell's is an exception, though. Loneliness comes in. We're human. We're so human. And the outside, the beyond, just seems arid. It seems like something, even though it's beautiful, but it's as sort of away from us as nature seemed to people in the 19th century. Things like this idea of it being other. God, I mean, it's just so peculiar and so distant and, inhospitable in a way
Right.
to us. So.
Do you think that the poems you turned to, that sort of touched upon the skyward, the heavenly,
Yeah.
acknowledged our ability to only do that momentarily, because to really contend with the world
Right.
beyond the world we're
It's
in
overwhelming.
is overwhelming.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. Yeah, I think that's part of it, and I think that there's a sense that, I mean, one thing that kind of dawned on me as I was working on this is that, that we're haunted by it, and that poets kind of, they're just touching on it, but that's all they have to do, to, kind of hit us with it. But you're right, maybe just to write about it alone would be just, it wouldn't connect to us, really. But I think the fact that we don't have control of our lives is what art is about in a weird way, in general. And so this is like the largest kind of range of that. I think. Yeah.
Well, also, I was thinking about the relationship of this talk to, and the heavens and the stars to language, and how maybe poetry fits with astronomy in the sense that it's constantly thinking about what's beyond us, but thinking about it from the vantage point of the worldly, of the contained, of when you have to, as a poet, ground your poems in imagery, but then think about the unknown, the unsayable, the sublime.
To kind of split it open, crack it open. I mean, when I'm teaching my students, you need to crack this poem open. It's like just too kind of staid. It doesn't have that kind of terrifying thing. It doesn't ever, it's like the student poet is afraid, to let it in. But yeah, I mean, so I think the fact that this idea that we're in space, this is space. I mean, this is the universe right here. I think that's really helpful for someone to think about, and I think poets try to bring that alive, to bring that into people's experience, make them aware of it, even though it's kind of frightening. I can also remember talking to a student and saying that, if we thought about this stuff all the time, I'd be hiding under here, even though it wouldn't help. But that's what I would have the illusion of safety here. You can't think about this stuff all the time; you go crazy. But still, the fact that it's really true, really there, is sort of is also kind of exhilarating. To face up to. And poems try to kind of do it nicely, try to make you feel good, but also scared, a little bit of both.
Right, to have to contend with that. Well, I wondered about your poem, Rare Earth. Is that the two-poem sequence? Where you engage with the scientific and then you move to the historic, and you begin with a talk about the scientists, and then you talk about the Romans who are looking at the sun and trying to bring the sun back, or they're not seeing the sun, they have the fires to bring the sun back. And I wondered how poetry, and especially with something like astronomy, how poetry engages with both our kind of romantic desires and the sort of scientific reality that we understand.
I like scientific language. I like how it kind of cuts through the romanticized thing, because that seems like kind of it's like some kind of thick clothing to protect you. It's like you're wrapped up in something. And I don't like that. I like the more stark. I like to face that. The whole idea, the word abyss kind of has a romantic association, which I kind of I took that off of. I took that off of that word. I removed that clothing and exposed it for what it was, which is stark, arid, terrifying kind of thing, that we are alone, this idea that we're alone amidst these enormous spaces that don't care about us, So I think that's what I was interested in doing in that poem. And then the second part is the same kind of deal. This, kind of laughing at them, this idea that they could persuade the sun to do anything, the sun's not listening, the sun doesn't care. Another poem I was going to read about, I saw in the paper 2 photographs of the sun, and one, it looked like normal with its, sunspots and everything. And then the second photograph had no sunspots. It's just like, God, what is this? Is really, that this could happen. I'm not a scientist, so it's like, shit, you know,
Yeah.
what is this thing? You know, what if it stopped? What if it goes away? You know, and the idea that the Earth's orbit has changed the angle of the sunlight into these mounds just slightly. It still goes in those holes, so it's amazing that it still goes in them after, you know, 5,500 years. But, you know, it's not going to always go in there, you know?
It
So
reflects a certain change.
the sense of the sun like turning away from us or going away, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
that's it, you know, we're
Yeah.
done. So, I mean, so it really, you know, it starts just being about fear of death, you know,
Yeah.
I think.
Do you think too that compared to other sciences
Yeah.
and other scientists that astronomers, poets can relate to astronomers because they're studying this thing that is so great, so
Right,
grand,
right.
that they're trying to define.
They're
But
being
it's very clear.
precise.
It's very clear that we don't know. You know.
We don't
That
know.
even scientists don't
Right.
know what's out there.
That's
They have to sort of acknowledge their inability to reckon with it all
Absolutely.
as they're
Absolutely.
following, you know, in the scientific method.
I can remember in college or graduate school, I can't remember where I was, people were talking about the humanities and science and how, you know, I think that there's this kind of assumption that scientists know everything, doctors know everything, you know, you know, but they're arts, you know,
Yeah.
they're so much closer than, yeah, I think that's definitely true.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the sort of cutting through the romantic, I love the precision of instruments. I love their kind of discipline.
Yeah.
And that really appeals to just my sensibility as a
Yeah.
poet. Sort of not letting the emotions, you know, carry the day in a weird way. You know, even
Yeah.
though I'm trying to expose things to make people feel, but the way I do it is very stark. And I
Yeah.
think it's very connected. I think I was very ill when I was a teenager, and I think I've had a lot of, you know, I also started out as a biology major, so maybe, I don't know, maybe that has something to do with it. But I really always had this respect for that kind of cold kind of language, the Latin
Yeah.
diction, and trying to use that to undermine, or to work against, kind of to play against a more kind of emotional kind of language, and try to, you know, you always want to surprise the reader, always pulling the rug out from the reader one way or another, and you can do it by, you know, having one kind of language going for a while, and then bam,
Right.
another kind, redefining a word like abyss, you know, just
Right.
exposing it for what it really is,
Right.
things like that.
Well, it also makes me think about the selection you read from the Reef and the way in which you
Oh, right,
connected
right,
the
right.
inner and the outer. That you
Right.
looked at that, you know, we went from the body, the inside
Right,
the body
right.
to this hurricane that reached to the stars.
Right, and the sense that it's moving, but it's, you know, you're mapping it on Earth, but actually you can't map anything, you know, it's like
Yeah.
everything's moving, there's no
Yeah.
way to map it, and so there's a sense of absolute loss of control, and then
Yeah.
a kind of rage that comes out of that
Yeah.
in a person. Yeah, it's huge, and it's huge stuff. I love that Bishop poem, where she does kind of the
Yeah.
same thing, you know, she has this idea of the moon, and then the eye, I
Yeah.
haven't quite figured it all out, but there's definitely this inner, you know, outer thing going on there too.
Exactly. Well, going through the hole of the moon, I
Yeah.
mean, that image was so
Yeah.
evocative
Amazing.
of
Yeah.
exactly that's the sort of limits and the expanse that
Yeah.
when one looks up has to engage
right,
with.
Right. And, yeah, like the man was sort of like the Romans, you know,
Right.
seeing the moon as assuming it's a hole,
Right.
assuming the sun can be persuaded.
Right.
Similar things, yeah.
The other thing I wanted to discuss was the way in which we see the gods in the heavens, and of course you reckon with that in your poem about Mount Etna. And I wondered if you could just speak to why we do that. Why, you know, and it seems also
Well, we think they're up there.
yeah, and we
down
look at the
here.
stars and we make
Right.
the gods out of these constellations,
right.
you know, which is in and of itself a kind of, you know,
Right.
a supreme metaphor
Right.
that I think connects to what poetry
Yeah.
through metaphor and simile and figurative language tries
Right.
to do.
I don't really think about that very much. I have to say, I don't think about that very much. I have that Titan in there, but he's like under, you know, the idea that
Yeah.
he's like causing all the earthquakes and everything because he's trying to get out of there.
Yeah.
Can't. I don't know why. I just don't really, I haven't thought about that very much.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say about that.
So
It's
for you-
odd. Maybe just because all the power seems to be up there, you know,
Right.
the sun
Right.
was, you know, the first
Right.
god, probably, right? Just the idea that we're just, you know, is it going to rain? You know, is it not going to rain? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That kind of, like, we're just sort of little kids waiting,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
I mean, now they're like making clouds in Alaska, I think,
Uh-huh.
to slow down global warming, you know? So maybe we won't be so little.
Maybe we
We're
have-
getting a little bit bigger.
Yeah, we have just a
I
little
don't
bit of
have
control.
I don't have much faith in that.
No, but it's
anyway.
interesting. I mean, I think you can look at the heavens and think of some sort of supreme power and you know,
Right.
make that kind of meaning out of the stars. Or you
Right.
can also look at them and think of the great abyss and the unknowable,
Right.
which seems
And they're
more
kind of
your train.
related. I mean, I remember hearing on the radio one time this such a profound thing, and I'm sure it's not the first time it was said, but it hit me. is that faith, you know, the faith that you have, if you're a religious person, the faith that you have it relies on lack of faith. I mean, its power comes from fear, you know, it comes from lapses in faith. And one of the best writers for that, one of the best poets is Hopkins, and it's those late sonnets, the terrible sonnets where he's struggling with his, you know, he was a monk, so he was, you know, he was committed, a committed Christian, and but he had these dark moments, and he's like in the poems, it's like the words are struggling, you know, it's just incredible. So I think they're related. I mean, they can be related. I mean, scientists talk about that, about, you know, being scientists who have faith in God still recognize that they can, you know, there's still stuff to figure out.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, on that note, I wonder if any of you have any questions you'd
let's
like
do
to
that.
ask our poet about. Yes, Allie.
Okay.
Rob referred to your mountain poem, the Evan poem.
Yes.
And what was running through my head was that there's a whole cluster, you could do a whole other program just on volcanoes.
On volcanoes. Yeah.
Or whatever it is, where it says these sudden ends of Pompeii.
Right.
These sudden ends of time must give us pause.
Yes.
We, you know, go into the future, not knowing that we're going to stop at a given moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Anne Carson was like, all she does is, Anne Carson's a wonderful poet, and she paints volcanoes. That's all she does. She paints only volcanoes. Yeah, it's funny.
Such a profound metaphor.
Oh yeah, it's incredible. Yeah, I'm trying to figure that poem out. It's a kind of a long poem, and I'm working on it. I'm working on it right now. But anyway, yeah.
No, and then it's hard not to, or useful, I think, to contrast that to the void when one looks up. And the whole idea of breaking out that you talked about, the earth breaking open that you talked about in the last poem, in the 9/11 poem, and how that then relates to how we see, you know, we see the void that presumably that fills. And it is a sort of metaphor itself, or a symbol itself for what we're doing when we try to write a poem, which is this very, you know, intense, engaged use of language that sort of supposedly, in a kind of romantic sense, emerges, but then has to contend with all the silence around it, all the space around it.
Right. Oh, that's interesting. That's beautiful. You have to tell Matea.
Yeah.
Rob's married to a poet.
I'm married to a poet, yes. Any other questions? Any other ideas? Any scientists here?
Because I feel like very insecure about the science part. Because there are people, I think Heather McHugh, some people really know a lot about physics and they get it in their poems. And when I walked in this room, I just panicked. I'm kind of an elementary school level physics person. But I'm curious if any of it was interesting or surprising. Scientifically, I don't think so. Probably not.
Well, I think ultimately poems, even when they're engaging with scientific language, are charged with a different kind of purpose.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're using it.
Yeah.
We're always trying to find ways to set up the reader.
Yeah,
to
indeed.
feel.
And yet, you know, in my job, I've had the opportunity to sort of travel around DC, and I went out to NASA Goddard, and they have astrophysicists out there who have all sorts of great terminology for the word that they're using.
Right.
I forget, they have this thing that's the lightest substance known to man, and I think it's not called a liquid cloud, but it's called something along those lines, and you hold it and you can't even feel it. And they use it, they put it on, what are they called? Not spaceships, they put it on, what are the things that float around the world?
Satellites.
They put it on satellites to collect the
I feel much
dust.
better now.
Yeah. I'm like, I can't think of, the proper word. I'm talking metaphorically. You can't think of the actual term. They put it on satellites to collect the space dust to then bring down and look at for organic materials. But it was shocking to see, and wonderful to see, that they used such great metaphoric language to describe this thing that had had real scientific value, but had real scientific value in a search for the unknown.
I went to the Fermi Lab one time, and I was amazed by, I had a friend, and we were taking a little tour, and every, 10 steps, there was like a little alcove. It was along this kind of corridor of offices, and then there was a little alcove with blackboards. Blackboard, and all these equations, and I started realizing they're not speaking English. There's like a point where the English can only take them so far, and suddenly they've got to start writing in their language.
Yeah. And yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. 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 It's wondrous, yeah. It's like, right, right, right. Yeah. Yeah, the planet swimming into view. I mean, that's maybe one of those. Maybe that's sort of like what. I mean, I mean, it's like a thought swimming into view, but it's like this discovery and just amazing, just amazement, just astonishment and amazement at what's up there, out there.
Well, and that's an interesting example, and I think a key example of what poems can do, because it's using that verb, it's using that verb metaphorically, and
Right,
it's connecting,
swimming.
yeah, and it's connecting the celestial to the earthly.
Right.
But then if you think about it, it's comparing two worlds that we don't quite know, because
Right.
we don't really understand what lies, you know, at the bottom of the ocean either. The oceans are these great vast things we live among and
Right.
rely upon,
Right,
but that we're sort of contending with in the same way. So I think it's that kind of reckoning, not only that reckoning, but a kind of inclusion, right, of that language, the kind of play that happened in that line, the planet swim into
Swims into
view.
view, right.
And also the way in which it is swimming into view, the way in which it's defining a kind of seeing.
Right.
You know, and poems can do that. They can kind of, you know, shift how we see things,
Right.
reimagine.
It makes me think of just the physical body too, and how things swim, and you know, I mean, just we're water, we're made of
Right,
water. You know,
right,
there's
it's
kind of
true,
a
that's
sense of
true.
swimming, things sort of coming into view, but it does seem like doesn't seem like they're just, you know, snapping into view.
Yes.
They're moving gradually into view a little bit. So they have to go through something like water.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's such a great image. It's hard to define why these things work. It's hard to explain why. But that's the thing that I remember. I mean, the Cortez thing is amazing too. That moment at the end, that's at the end. And they're in awe, and they're looking at each other with wild surmise. You know, it's so
Yeah.
beautiful. But what I always remember about that poem is a planet. That's what sticks in my mind.
Yeah.
It's odd.
Yeah, and I think what makes poetry powerful in a way that connects it to religion is that sense of having to engage with the things we don't know and offer a
Right.
kind of instruction, but a kind of instruction that is open-ended.
Right.
Um,
Right.
And
Right.
certainly there's nothing more open-ended than what we see above us.
Right. That's right. Absolutely. For us, yeah. It's like, where's the limit to that?
Yeah, yeah,
The last frontier, right?
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth,
Okay,
for your
thank
great
you.
reading.
Thanks for
Thanks for
inviting me.
coming out.
Okay.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.